Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone, and welcome to Wealth Pathways, the Affluence Science Insights Podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Marie Stella, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. Real estate is a tangible asset, and it has for a long time proven to be a viable source of passive income. And as cities evolve and urban landscapes undergo transformation, more and more opportunities are being presented. So from prime features to potential risks, we'll be examining the factors that make for a solid real estate investment and look at the intersection of real estate and urban affluence. To guide us through this is real estate consultant Sean Godoy. Passionate about Sub-Saharan Africa, Sean assists innovative real estate businesses with market entry within the continent, as well as outwards to Europe, the UK, and other regions. As an independent consultant, he not only works with his clients on innovation strategy, but also with property tech providers to fine-tune their products for the real estate industry. So we're extremely fortunate to have him here with us today. Hi, Sean. Welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Sabrina. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and in your line of work, what have you found to be the most misconception about real estate investments?
I suppose with any investment, there's quite a lot of misconceptions that people have, but probably, so it's viewed as, in terms of all the investment options or investment asset classes, it's viewed as one of the more lower risk options. So while it is low risk, like any investment, I always say to my students or my clients that I work with, you have to understand that there will still be risk. It's low risk, but there is still risk. So you have to really understand that. And it's all about doing your research and doing your homework before making any decisions. So just acknowledge that the risk is there, even though it's a different type of risk compared to, say, working with shares on the stock market.
What kind of risks that is mostly apparent in the real estate world?
So probably what comes to mind, so you mentioned passive income. So in this context, I think it's just maybe important to clarify, we're talking about rental property. So you purchase a property as a landlord and you rent that property out for income and capital growth. So probably the biggest risk in that context would be periods without a tenant. So if your property is vacant, that's the one. It's a two-part risk. So overall, it's tenant risk. So it'll be a period that the property is vacant, so you don't have a tenant, or you have a problem tenant, which most landlords, this is their main concern or their main worry. So a tenant that perhaps stops paying or a tenant that damages the property, that's probably one of the most important risks when it comes to that. But there's obviously mitigating steps you can take when you're doing that. And again, it's all about research. And I often tell my students, because I also deliver some real estate courses, I often tell them it's all about the 3 Ps: preparation, preparation, preparation. So you could do a lot of preparation around choosing your tenants to help reduce that risk.
I see. So doing due diligence, especially in search of our tenants.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, I like that you mentioned due diligence, actually. That's the key. When we talk about preparation, we basically mean due diligence. So DD, that's what it's all about.
That's really quite fascinating. We talked about a little bit about the misconceptions and what we need to do to mitigate those risks. And it serves as a great preface to our topic for the day. But before we dive further into today's topic, we'd like to get to know you better. And this is Have You Met Sean? Okay, so Sean, what do you enjoy during your spare time?
I think maybe most people, I think socializing with friends is always important. And trying to make time for friends is not always an easy thing. But probably
Indeed.
my wife and I, the main sort of passion we have is travel. So we try to do that as much as possible. We have a little boy, he's 2.5. So obviously it makes the whole traveling agendas changed a little bit. But I think travel is still one of our big passions. And we did a lot of it before. We lived in London for a few years before returning to South Africa. So the main thing we did was focus on travel and not saving money so much, but there's no regrets.
Wonderful, especially with a toddler around. They can get quite a handful, but they really make the joy out of the day.
100%.
What is your favorite book or movie?
I guess I have quite a few movies. I quite like Lord of War. That's with Nicolas Cage. I don't know, that always just grabbed me. It's quite a fascinating story. In terms of books, I quite like Wilbur Smith. I haven't read him for a few years, but he did an Egyptian series. So there's 3 books, I believe. And he's actually a South African writer, Wilbur Smith, and he's known for researching his books meticulously, and they reflect culture and history quite closely. So he did a lot on South Africa with a story set in South Africa, but he did this 3-book Egyptian series, and I think that's still one of my favorite books. There's one of the books in the series particularly. So I think that would be it. It's not always an easy choice to your favorite.
So is that more of an Egyptian mythology, or is that a nonfiction?
It's fiction, but set in, like I said, it's culturally and historically accurate. So it is fiction, though. It's a story, yeah. So it's enjoyable because I do read actually a lot of nonfiction. But this one, I like it because it's a mix. There's a good story, but you're also learning as you go along, I suppose.
Yeah. Fictions are rather enjoyable, especially with good storytelling and world building. Are you listening to any podcasts at the moment?
So I'm not actually a sort of a avid listener of podcasts. So I tend to jump around when I do listen, but I quite like, in the vein of reading nonfiction, I quite like history podcasts. So especially I think I'm just trying to remember the name. There's one called A Short History of, and then it just breaks down certain periods of history or certain events, in like short bite sizes. So I quite like the history ones. And then I do listen to some real estate podcasts as well. There's one, if anyone's interested in the South African context, there's one called The Corner Office, which is quite good. So that's a real estate podcast hosted by the CEO of one of the sort of prominent property companies here.
Yeah, that's a wonderful topic for our African listeners. And do you have a role model?
Role model? I suppose I do. I've actually, not someone in sort of popular culture, but it's one of my professors from university. So he actually lectured me many years ago, and then we kept in touch. And subsequently, we kind of just connected quite well, and he became a bit of a mentor and a role model. So we've kept in touch and we've worked together over the years. And I just like the way he thinks and the way he views the world and the way he views work as part of family. And the main thing I quite liked was he said life's always like a portfolio. So, you have family and friends should always be the most important. And then there's your work, which is also important, not just for making a living, but sort of filling your passion cup. And then there's like the voluntary, sort of maybe academic or voluntary pursuits. So I like the way that he spoke about a portfolio, I guess, and trying to get a balance. But yeah, he's probably, I guess if I was going to think of a role model, I'd think of him, yeah.
I see. So thinking about life as in like diversification of portfolio, that's actually quite a unique intake on life.
Yeah. No, it always spoke to me. I quite like it. And then obviously in the realm of like real estate or anything financial, it's funny because if you hear portfolio, you think of numbers and money and, dollars and
Yeah,
cents.
that's right. And last question for this segment is there a course that has inspired you so far?
Yeah, so I guess I could say my own courses inspire me. I do deliver two short courses on real estate, online courses, and
Mm-hmm.
then I lecture a university course as well. I'm not saying that to toot my own horn, but I get inspired by my students. I think it's always like talking about that portfolio, like we just did. I think if you're
Yeah.
able to teach on the topic that you practice, and it's something you're passionate about, it's a wonderful opportunity. But there's so many. There's probably not one in particular, but I know there's so many organizations that offer free courses and free education, and I think that's a wonderful thing. And if you just dig a little bit online, you can find some really interesting courses, especially around tech and AI. Obviously, that's a big hype at the moment. So yeah, I think free education, I suppose, is quite inspiring on its own.
I find it quite wonderful that you say that your own course inspired you, not because of how you teach, but it's because your student has taught you a lot of stuff and provided you with new insights. So that's a really wonderful mindset to have, not just learning from teachers, but from your students as well.
Yeah, definitely. And we say, because on one of the courses, I teach alongside a colleague, and we always say we both learn a lot. Each course we deliver, we also learn, because students think it's just a one-way street, but they have unique perspectives and insights. So it's always a two-way street, which is really exciting.
Wonderful seeing that from a lecturer/teacher's perspective. And now we can get into today's topic, which is the intersection of real estate and urban affluence. So for starters, what does affluence mean to you, Sean?
I guess it can mean a few different things also, especially if you get a bit philosophical, but in its, core meaning, affluence would mean sort of higher income levels, higher levels of wealth. So within perhaps a group of people or an area. So it's effectively, I don't want to use the word successful, because success isn't linked just to income and wealth, but it is talking about higher income levels, higher levels of wealth.
And how would you define urban affluence?
Well, in terms of the urban context, that would be a specific area that's known to be affluent. So you always, you hear often about an area being described as affluent, and it means obviously that it's a area of higher property values, probably quite unique properties. High, I guess what you would call high end. So high end finishes, unique design, or sort of cutting edge design. But I think a variety is important. So you'd have, modern homes alongside more established homes that have more classical kind of features. Because I know, like South Africa, I know a lot of Australian cities, they have a lot of older properties that are quite revered, and there's obviously heritage regulations to keep the sort of the look and the feel of these properties. So I think generally, again, you could look at it purely financially, so it's higher value properties, but I think it's the type of properties. Quality could be one thing, but more about uniqueness and size. Obviously, you probably have large properties, but you have a range, so you'll have sort of large freestanding homes, you might have gated communities, and then apartments, obviously, or duplexes, depending how you call that. So we call them complexes. So you might have a few units, and then apartments are important as well, because you need variety of options. People have different lifestyles.
I see. So one common theme I hear from that is high valued properties with good neighborhoods in general.
Yeah, that's good. And that's as as I finished talking, I was thinking about the other aspects, because you just said good neighborhoods, and like, what makes a good neighborhood. So you want a good range of amenities, so green space, good schools, shops, maybe a different economic activity nearby. So there might be a more commercial area with offices and shops, that type of thing. So you want that mixed use nature as well, can be quite important. So that means having some retail, maybe some commercial, but not too much, because you still want it to be like a neighborhood. So it's more for residential people living, they want it to be quiet, but within a reasonable distance, you want access to shops and other types of service providers, that type of thing. And I think green space is quite important.
I see. So great urban planning as well that comes into play. And what are some examples of such affluent urban cities or neighborhoods? We did mention a little bit, but can you explain more on what are the nitty-gritty of what affluent urban cities or neighborhoods would look like?
Yeah, sure. I suppose you sort of hit the nail on the head. So good urban planning. So you want well laid out neighborhoods. So you want that. What that means is you have a predominantly residential area. So like I said, you want to be near a certain economic activity, but you don't want that on your doorstep where there's high levels of traffic, high noise levels, this type of thing. So you want it well played, sort of well planned. So you want it as, it's almost like a bit of a bubble. So you want it to be quiet and there's green space, etc. And then, those amenities. So that's quite an important thing. So I mentioned again, the green space, the schools. I guess in Affluent City, I suppose, Australia, I have been to Australia once, only to Brisbane. So I've had a bit of an experience of the city. So in terms of an affluent city, it obviously, first of all, for me, it accommodates everyone, because we're talking about high income levels, high levels of wealth. One of the big challenges is that a lot of people are excluded. So you want your cities to be more inclusive, and if they could accommodate lower income earners with more affordable housing, that's the dream. It's not difficult. It's not easy to achieve that in practice, but it is the goal. So an affluent city should have, first of all, a lot of public space, I think, which I think Australian cities are really good at. So that green space, you'll have promenades along the rivers, and a lot of interesting installations. Because I know in Brisbane, you go along the South Bank and there's a variety of parks. You have those barbecues that you can use. And there was even like a little forest walk where they'd created a bit of a tropical environment and you could walk on a wooden platform. So I think those types of things. So the city is affluent, which means it has a certain level of economic activity. It obviously collects a certain amount of revenue, and it spends that revenue on upgrading public space and obviously your roads, your bridges. You want all of that to work well. But I think public initiatives are really important, something that gives the citizens a sense of space, first of all, that they can sort of live their lives and enjoy. And it's nice to enjoy something where it's not commercial, you're not paying for that. It's more that the city welcomes you, and it welcomes everyone. That's the thing. Anyone can access a park or take a walk along a really nice promenade. And then there's also really good initiatives. I remember seeing this in a Brisbane park. There were people from the local council that would host a sort of play/learning group in the park. And you could, if you were in the park, they obviously let you know when it's happening, and you could join this play group. Obviously, the parents would stay close by. But that's a free service that's offered by the council, which is wonderful. And you don't see this as much in some, so say, South African cities or African cities. They're dealing with big challenges like trying to get the roads right and the planning, because some of the cities grew without too much planning or regulation. So you're trying to manage these bigger issues. So sometimes those really good things like good public space get lost in the wash, But I think an affluent city should be inclusive. I think that's a big thing, and it should give residents space to live their lives.
I see. So places with third spaces, and in some cases, it's in some countries, such spaces are not yet available because they are still focusing on fixing the infrastructure.
Yes.
And what are the key factors that contribute to the formation of affluent urban neighborhoods? We did mention about the holistic aspect, right? The public spaces that's needed. But what do you think are the main ones that contribute to the initiation of the formation of such affluent urban neighborhoods?
Sure. So I think the first one, maybe there's two are probably a highlight, and it's one that I haven't yet mentioned, which which is like what you hear all the time with real estate is location. So location, location, location.
I
So
agree.
with affluent suburbs, you normally had, when the city first started, there would have been the wealthier areas. So when it started growing, there was a wealthier area and different types, industrial area, commercial. But you'll have these areas that by their nature, they were there in the sort of beginning stages of development, which means they're very well located. So they might be located near one of the first parks. They located near the sort of center of the city that's quite appealing, that has all the activity. So their location is normally prime. And the second thing which is linked to that is history. So they established neighborhoods. Often the affluent neighborhoods are quite established. They kind of tree-lined. You've got that image of tree-lined neighborhood with
Yeah.
the lovely park, etc. So they're often established. So that's not the case. That's not always the case, because cities do grow and you get newer areas. So I'm in Johannesburg, for example. So also on the sort of outskirts of the city, they've built new sort of more gated communities where they deliver all the factors that we've spoken about. So often private developers come in, they step in and deliver those factors. So that's on the sort of more outskirts. And then some of them are more eco estates or eco neighborhoods. So it means you want to be somewhere with more space, etc. But when I hear an affluent suburb, it's normally one that's closer to the city center, closer to the original economic activity, but also in a way that, like I said, has its little bubble of tree-lined streets and there's some level of quiet, but it's a good location. I think that's probably one of the key elements, along with everything else we spoke about. I think location is really key, and the way it's developed to offer those things that are quite important. And then people generally, it depends on the city, but like I mentioned, they value historical buildings, and there's something very unique about that. If you're living in a home that's 100 years old and you've got, perhaps there's wooden features, wooden flooring, original fireplaces or pressed ceilings. I know in Australian context, people quite like that as well. And we have it in South Africa as well. Those, I suppose, circa, 1900 homes built around 1900 or so. So I think location and history plays a role, because it takes time for a neighborhood to mature. So you can't just recreate that. So that, again, is what adds the value, is that it's taken time for this neighborhood to grow organically, and it's been established for many decades.
I see. So mostly location and history. And what makes a real estate investment worth pursuing under the umbrella of having it in urban affluence, in an
No,
affluent neighborhood?
It's a good question, because when you're analyzing a real estate investment, you look at it from a few different factors. So the main factors probably, I would say, are risk. So we spoke about risk. So some properties will have a higher risk, some will have a lower risk. And then the next is, again, just breaking it down simply, is investment potential. So that has two factors, because with property you have capital growth. So the scope for that property's value to grow. And then the other one we mentioned is rental income. So if you're buying that property to rent, you can buy properties to flip. So you buy them, you maybe do some cosmetic or some larger renovations or improvements, and then you sell that property on. So there is a scope for increasing value. But I think, like I said, when people think real estate, they think a longer term investment. That's what we're looking at. So, just to come back. So in summary, it's the risk level, and then it's the investment potential. So the interesting thing here is, in a new up and coming neighborhood, so maybe a neighborhood that's changing a lot, commercial buildings are being converted into residential apartments, and they're finding new spaces to develop residential homes. You might find that there's a lot of scope for capital growth, but at the same time, there's a higher level of risk because, there's potential, but things could change. Maybe certain planning laws hold things back, or there's an industrial area that people thought, oh, that'll be converted to apartments, but then it doesn't. So that's just examples of where that risk could be, because risk is inherent in a urban environment that's changing. So it can be a great opportunity, but also you might just end up with a property in the wrong location. So you have that higher risk example where you might have a higher return, but in a sort of more established affluent area, you have more, like I said, there's history. It's a more established neighborhood. So what that means is, first of all, there'll be higher values. So your investment profile has to include, a higher value appetite. So in those neighborhoods, you'll have very low risk, but what low risk translates into in the real estate investment space is a lower return, but you've got a higher value. So it means you're happy to take the lower return because it's very steady. That's going to happen, obviously. And then if you get a smaller level of capital growth, you've got a higher value, so you're still getting a decent return. But basically, you're accepting a lower return for lower risk in the end of the day. So an affluent neighborhood would be low risk because it's established. People want to live there. Generally, the tenant risk should be lower as well. So in a nutshell.
Generally, higher value real estates require higher capital. How can we differentiate whether it's an asset for us or whether it will become a future liability for real estate investment in urban affluence?
So I guess, like I said, linked to the lower risk is that you'll have a lower risk that if, say, you bought an apartment or a home to rent out in an affluent area, you'd have a lower risk. So it's likely that won't turn into a liability. So you could say, tenant risk is very hard to map, but perhaps you say it's lower in a high income area. I mean, that's not always necessarily how things play out. Tenants can come in a variety of forms, but you could say,
Indeed.
Generally speaking, if you look at that, you could say there's a lower tenant risk. So overall, there's probably less chance that it would turn into a liability, because also, like I said, that city grew organically. So there's not a lot of chance of the neighborhood changing, or because you have what you call, you could call it different things, but I guess you could call it neighborhood risk. So the risk that the neighborhood will change, that, like I said, someone will open a shop or something like a small industrial space manufacturing something like leather goods, and then there's maybe restaurants opening where there's smells and there's noise. So you have this neighborhood risk, which is external factors will come in that make it less desirable, and then they'll impact on the value at the end of the day. So I think with a sort of higher value area, you've got less chance of ending up with a liability.
I see. And as you mentioned, in affluent areas, right, it would be high value for us, and it requires what we look for is the location and its history. What are its main benefits to investing specifically in affluent urban areas?
So touching on the points I mentioned, probably one of the main benefits is that low risk nature. So yes, it's higher capital value, but you might be in a position where, like I said, you're willing to forego high capital growth and rental return. You're willing to forego that because your money is going to be safe. It's the same as if you choose an investment product. You choose, say, with your retirement savings, etc. Normally, you choose like aggressive or moderate or higher risk, low risk, medium risk, that type of thing. So when you're choosing all these different types of properties, there's different areas. One of the main benefits is that low risk nature. So your money's quite safe, because generally real estate is lower risk, like I said, but it's even lower risk in an affluent neighborhood where things are less likely to change and the desirability is less likely to change.
I see. And we did mention a little bit about risks, especially about vacancies and problem tenant. What are the potential threats and challenges of investing in affluent urban areas like oversaturation, heavy competition?
Mm. Probably, I suppose competition is an important one. So one way, like thinking of competition, is supply. So that's new properties coming onto the market. So in these areas, these higher value areas, like I said, you'll have less, there's less change. So it's unlikely that they'll say there's mostly large freestanding homes. It's unlikely that the planning permission would allow someone to build a block of apartments, because that, there's certain things like increased traffic, blocking lights, because you even have something called right of light, which is if a property blocks blocks your light, basically, if you end up being in the shade most of the day, that's obviously a negative impact. It's less desirable, and anything less desirable means a higher impact on value. So probably the changing nature is less of a risk, and you should have less competition. So I'm trying to think what the threats are, but it's probably, maybe there could be limited opportunities to actually enter that market. Maybe properties come on the market less often. Investors and homeowners hang on to them. But yeah, I guess the point is there's less threats. I'm just trying to think of something that stands out besides that. Yeah, I don't think there's the risks that are inherent in a more up and coming area, obviously not present in the same way. The one issue could be, if I mentioned you want to change the property, there's often quite strict heritage regulations that come with these properties. So you have to maintain how they look. And that's often on the exterior, but it can be on the interior as well. So you might be limited. So you buy this home and you're like, I want to extend, add another garage. I want to, resurface the exterior, and then you're quite limited in that way. So you have to work with what you have, basically, which is normally, like I mentioned, quite desirable, but perhaps people want a more modern feel, and you might be limited in what you can do to offer that. So perhaps you could say a stricter framework of operating as a property investor. You've got less wiggle room, I guess you could say.
I see. So one of the threats would be changes in law and policy making, especially in the changes that we would like to make, and it may not be as freely as we want it to be. And gentrification is a decades-old global phenomenon that often sees a particular area undergoing urban renewal and revitalization. In what ways does this affect real estate investments?
Well, it's like I mentioned, those higher risk changing environments, which offer a higher opportunity for capital growth or investment returns. There's always negative impact. So an area might change. There's new housing stock. There might be new shops opening, new amenities. But what that does is push prices up. So that's why you make a better return. But it pushes prices up, and then it starts to exclude certain people. And it often, location. It often happens, like I said, a city develops organically. So what you see it in major cities all over the world, an area that was industrial, like say the meatpacking district in New York, just as an example that comes to mind, that's now become uber trendy, or like Brooklyn, because there was that level of gentrification. All these really cool industrial buildings have become really interesting retail space or quite funky apartments. So it's always inherently going to be a risk. And like I said, the goal of cities, and a lot of them have it on their agenda, is inclusionary cities. So, as they develop, how can they retain certain housing stock as to make it more affordable? Does the local council, the government get involved? Do you have specialist affordable housing and developers like you have in the UK? That's a model that works quite well. So, how do you manage that? And you want the city to be inclusionary. That's a truly successful city. So in those areas, it's difficult to manage. It really is, especially in a free market. You can't constrain developers or
That's right.
private entities, but you have to find a way that there's harmony in the policy and not impacting that sort of natural free market activity, which is crucial. You need a city to change and adapt, but you need to try and make it change and adapt in the right way.
I see. So from what I understand, it actually depends on what market trends are going. So the gentrification of a certain suburb, it relies on what people find good at the time. And it's interesting that you mentioned the UK, because my next question is, from your experience assisting real estate businesses with market entry across regions like Europe and the UK, how does urban affluence and real estate differ across countries?
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. It really, I guess, in certain countries, there's certain requirements that need to be met. So I suppose thinking of South Africa and a lot of more sort of complex emerging markets, security becomes an issue because you inherently tend to have a higher crime rate. So when you're talking about these affluent suburbs, security becomes one of the first desires or the first requirements, almost a non-negotiable. So that's why I remember I mentioned on the outskirts of, say, Johannesburg, you'll have these new urban environments that are developed, and they're often very high security, they're gated, or even older suburbs, they actually temporarily close certain roads and they make one or two points of entry, points of access. So then you can kind of control the traffic, you can kind of have a better level of security. So I think security is a big one in more developing emerging markets, which you call, I like the term complex markets. So they're still developing, they have higher levels of inequality, this type of thing. So then on the other end of the spectrum, it's probably, so like London is a really old city, so comparably Johannesburg or Sydney, they're younger cities. So the affluent suburbs are like even more entrenched and like they're even more unlikely to change. And the values are some of the highest property values you'll see, like Knightsbridge or Chelsea in London. It's just so strictly controlled. Like then you become on a global scale, that's some of the most high value, most sought after real estate in the world, if you're talking like a global city. So you have that in Sydney as well, or like as an example. And it's still a younger city, but it has some of the same dynamics. But just somewhere like London, these areas it's almost like a museum, things aren't going to change. And these properties, it'll stay the same for years. And in that consistency, there becomes desirability, but also, again, lower risk. And I guess more desirability. I mean, people know these neighborhoods are like set in stone, which most are, like, excuse the pun, I guess, but they just like globally, often people know the names. They know, that address means a lot. It's a very desirable address. So it's probably, again, a history. I think that really adds a lot. You can have, like in London, they build new, like amazing new apartments. The Battersea power station area is a good example. They converted the whole power station to kind of a shopping district, and there's new apartments, there's great urban public space. So that's quite important. But I think it's that history element again. It's something that's the thing. It's something you can't recreate if you've got this established neighborhood with amazing history.
That was rather fascinating, especially when you mentioned about desirability in places with centuries old history, and in other places, for example, in Africa, what people are looking for is actually security. So in different places of the world, people's desirability changes, especially in terms of what they're seeking for and what they need in the area. And I'd like to ask, what are some of the challenges and opportunities presented by international real estate markets from your experience handling these different real estates from all across the globe?
So I think challenges when you're talking about different cities and affluence neighborhoods is, I suppose, a big one is how, like I said, a lot of the appeal is how established these neighborhoods are and the fact that they won't change. So in a city, in a more, I don't know, developing market or an emerging country, you might have things that are changing quite quickly. So that urban environment, you might see that policy changes more quickly. So the government might come in and they say, we want to develop a lot of affordable housing. We want to build new highways. We want to put new public transport in. So what that means is, while it's good, that infrastructure, perhaps they need to put a new train line, a new metro line straight through a really desirable area. And then inevitably what that's going to do is affect the value of those houses. So I think a challenge is in a more emerging market city is that it's quite not unstable, but there's more scope for change, because these cities are still, they're
still
a different
evolving.
yes, they're still evolving. They're at a different stage of development, whereas a city like London or Sydney or even parts of Johannesburg, the infrastructure's there, it's developed, there's strict policy, so there's less chance of that change happening, because change in the evolution can be good and it can be bad for property owners. So like I said, major infrastructure is generally good for a city, but it might impact certain neighborhoods. So that's where the challenge comes in. And sometimes it's unavoidable. They'll be like, this is the only route. It's for the greater good. And in the long run, neighborhoods will adjust, etc. But it might mean that those investors who wanted to, they were happy with, I'll take a low risk, but my money is very safe, they might actually end up losing some money. So that's the challenge there.
I see. And what about the opportunities presented by international real estate markets?
Yeah, so I think opportunities are probably, so I said, like in more established cities, the opportunity is basically that you have, they call it safe haven property. So generally property is seen as low risk and as a safe haven. I mentioned that low risk characteristic previously, but in more established cities, that's even more established, I suppose. Like I said, you get internationally competitive real estate. So if you're quite a wealthy person and you have homes in different countries and maybe your business is in different countries, you have a choice. You're like, should I buy a home in New York or should I buy a home in London? So you actually have international real estate markets. So that's quite an opportunity for those cities, because they can market globally. They have these high values, and also they can attract high net worth individuals. So it's an opportunity for the city. And for investors, if you're able to play in that realm, you can actually add a lot of value to a property, because these are very, like I said, they're wealthy people, they're high net worth individuals. You can basically, they might pay quite a lot more if you're able to add a basement, or you able to add an indoor swimming pool, because if that's very rare in the area, so if you find a way to do that, they might value that more, and you could actually have an increase that's higher than a market related increase. So that's quite an opportunity, because you're playing in a whole different sphere. Opportunities in more developing cities is, there's this changing nature. You have a chance maybe to create a new suburb. It happens in established cities. I mentioned Battersea in London, but those opportunities are very, very rare. Like that's one of the last areas where there'll be new development in sort of more central London. So there's opportunities in developing cities to create something. You could create a new suburb that's really affluent, because perhaps history is important in developing cities, and you'll have elements, like I said, in Johannesburg, it's a mining city. You had the first neighborhoods where all the mining moguls lived, and there's these beautiful sort of, historical homes with all those features that are so appealing. but you also have a chance to create something new, maybe not too far from the urban city. There was low density, so you could actually develop that so that the private developers create, a park and sort of apartments and maybe some freestanding homes. So there's more opportunity to create something, I think. And affluence looks different. So while the history and the heritage is important, there's less of that stock available in a developing city. So for a lot of people, perhaps affluence means new, it means modern, it means private developer led. So like I said, in Johannesburg, if anyone's interested, an example is Stain City. So it's basically a new city. It's like a walled city. So we're all about security, is always important, but inside they've got shopping centers, schools, public space. So it is created for certain segments of the market, which is exclusionary. I keep bringing that up because it is a challenge in cities, all cities, but even more so perhaps in developing cities. But that developer had an opportunity to create that. Whereas in a city like Sydney or London, that's not what people sort of desire. They want to be closer. They don't want to be further away. So that's a real opportunity, is creating something out of nothing, perhaps, in a developing city.
I see. And what are emerging trends do you see in urban affluence and real estate investment?
So I guess it depends. It's very market specific. But there are certain trends, like everyone loves to quote the work from home aspect. So there are trends where if you create homes that are sort of enable working from home, or sort of a home office type of element, that's quite desirable. So you get those pods actually that people put in their garden. It's basically a sort of a ready-made little pod, an office pod that you can put in your garden. So probably elements around remote working. Also, maybe these are very high level, but people spend more time at home, perhaps with, the rise of streaming services, etc. So you're less likely, for example, to go to the movies. The rise in home delivery. Obviously, there's a wide range of home delivery. So maybe people, they're spending more time at home. So you could always think about what people would like in that context. Maybe lots of things don't need to change, but you could also get quite creative with that. So I think that's an element. It's because any product should respond to consumer behavior or consumer preferences. So obviously property can't change from one day to the next, but if you're developing something new, you could think of these things. And another one it's emerging, but it's also, I suppose, well entrenched, is mixed use properties. So that concept of live, work, play. So the Battersea district in London is a good example of that. So in close proximity, they'll have a building that has residential apartments, it has office space, and then it has retail at the bottom, which could be shops, restaurants. And then there's a really good urban space. So it's really about live, work, play. You could have gyms, you could have outdoor activities perhaps being provided. If you're close to water, there could be water activities. So you could have a development that's designed and marketed as live, work, play. I think that really is what people look for. And it's also a case of, suppose if people want to spend more time at home, if your neighborhood or your development, your building offers these different amenities, also like meeting rooms, a gym in the building, people are quite keen. And some buildings have sort of cinemas in them as well.
Or mini theaters.
Yeah, exactly. Or spaces you could rent. So maybe you have a smaller apartment, but there's a dining room or an entertainment area you can rent or book within the building. So I've seen this when I stayed in an apart hotel in Brisbane. There was exactly that. So at the top floor, there was this amazing space, and you could book that for dinners or parties. So your apartment might not accommodate that, but the building does. So I think that's changing consumer preferences. They might take a smaller apartment, but the building's amenities even that out. And I think that live, work, play, it really is. It's a bit I suppose it's spoken about a lot, and maybe there's a bit of overkill there, but it really is, if you get it right, it makes a wonderful urban environment for people to live.
I see. How will technological advancements such as smart cities and sustainable development affect affluent urban areas and real estate opportunities by extension? You did mention a little bit about streaming services and the more apparent delivery services globally that can be accessed. But how will technological advancements like Internet of Things affect these?
Suppose it's a good question, because there's two levels. There's looking at the actual home, and then there's looking at the urban environment. So in terms of sustainability, there's a lot of benefit from retrofitting certain aspects of a home. So adding, solar panels to reduce reliance on the local grid. So pushing for renewable energy. If you have an IoT-enabled smart home, then certain aspects can be controlled remotely. Lighting could be automated so that you're not wasting electricity. If there's air conditioning, the smart home could automatically turn off air conditioning upstairs if there's no one actually there. So if there's no one there for 20 minutes, it actually shuts down the air conditioning. So there's certain aspects that it makes the home more comfortable, but also more sustainable. And then on a sort of urban environment, a city perspective, the way infrastructure is managed, traffic, sewage, water delivery, there's a lot of very sort of complex systems that can be put in place to measure and control that a lot better. So it can help create or sort of meet sustainability objectives. And that could also include the soft things, like what makes a building more appealing. So you could pedestrianize a street, and the way that you're able to pedestrianize it is that you have a kind of smart enabled traffic network. So perhaps certain lanes, if the traffic's high, they change automatically, one lane going in and 3 lanes coming out. So that's just an example. So if you took a road away to pedestrianize it so that it's more appealing socially, you could actually accommodate that change through technology. So it's a wide topic, but I hope those are good examples.
I see. And one last question: what potential challenges and opportunities do you foresee real estate investors experiencing in the future?
Sure, challenges, opportunities. So I guess again, quite a broad topic, but
Indeed.
Opportunities are always. I think with property, it's all about location, and from one neighborhood to the next, or one city to the next, the dynamics, the trends, the preferences of consumers, it differs so much. So I suppose it challenges understanding your neighborhood and where those opportunities are, because you really have to do that research, do that due diligence. So there's maybe some high level challenges and opportunities, but the important thing actually just to realize is that that's embedded in the nature of the local property market, the nature of the neighborhood that you're targeting and the city, etc., and what prospects that city has for growth or new developments or protecting existing neighborhoods. So I think it's just, I think it's with that question, I'll just take the opportunity to stress the importance of understanding the characteristics of where you're operating. And also I like one of my lecturers said, you must know your hood. So you've got to walk the streets. Like if it's a neighborhood you don't live in, or it's in another city, you should take time to actually walk, physically walk the streets, drive around the area, get to know the feel, see what shops are happening. Are there shops opening or closing? Get a feel for that, and what it's like to live there. And then it'll sort of spur ideas and give you that more closer understanding so that you can identify those opportunities.
That's actually a follow-up to my next question about understanding and walking in the hood. So what practice would you recommend for our listeners in understanding their due diligence in understanding the hood or remaining understanding the real estate and its urban affluence within their neighborhood that they want to invest in?
No, that's a good question. And I think it comes down to the principles of market analysis. So when you look at market analysis, there's different levels. So you start at neighborhood. Obviously, we've spoken a lot about the neighborhood and understanding, and that's when you say you know your hood. So that's sort of the micro level. So you're looking at the neighborhood. You then get the more regional level, which is understanding probably the city that you're playing in or the region of the city that you're playing in. So understanding the dynamics, what's happening. Is there new infrastructure? Is there new development? Is there, are areas you can tell they're really established, they're unlikely to change? So that's the regional level. Then there's the macro level, which would be the wider city or maybe state or province. So for example, I know in Brisbane, it's, I think, the fastest growing city in Australia. So there, at a macro level, you're like, that's an opportunity because there's people moving there. They need somewhere to live. And also prices will be going up. So if you get in early, you could actually be in an area where the demand's going to go up and the prices will go up. So that's the macro level. And at a regional level, you might know, the western side. I'm just making up a hypothetical example. You might know that the western side of Brisbane, they're going to be putting in new metro. They're going to be building a new mixed-use region. So there'll be more amenities, and more public space. So you're like, okay, on a regional level, that's going to have a good impact. And then at the micro level, you then identify a neighborhood that's close enough to reap that benefit, or a neighborhood where you see there's a lot of scope to upgrade the properties. Maybe they're older properties that, that people have lived in for many years. So there's a scope to buy at a good price and then to upgrade that property so that it's more desirable. You can get more rental income. You can increase the value. So I think if you think of it at those levels, that's a good real estate practice.
I see. And interestingly, you mentioned about macro and then micro. And I feel like for the understanding the neighborhood and walking in the neighborhood actually falls under the nano analysis in understanding the experience and how people would live there as an individual, experiencing its day-to-day basis and the roads and what are the things that we might need to want to enhance or not really enhance at the same time. So I feel like those practices, understanding the market analysis from macro to micro, is something important for people's due diligence before investing in such real estate pieces. And I feel like that is a wonderful practice that our listeners can take away. And we can move on now to our next segment, which is the open mic, where you have the chance to talk about anything that you're passionate about that doesn't have to be related to the topic. So, Sean, the stage is yours.
Excellent. Thank you. Sure. I say this a lot, but another broad topic. So I guess for me, and it came up in my bio that you read, is I'm very passionate about Sub-Saharan Africa. And
Sub-Saharan Africa.
It's that changing nature that I quite love. There's a lot of heavy challenges, but there's so much opportunity to create solutions, to create something new. You see it in the startup space. So I'm quite involved in the property technology space as a researcher and commentator. So I suppose for the listeners, like, my background is real estate. So I'm a real estate analyst by training. I studied a real estate degree. So I've kind of morphed into the kind of innovation side. So still there's fundamentals of real estate, but I look at these markets, there's so much opportunity for tech in the property market. So Proptech, to help leapfrog challenges like access to houses, access to rental. I mean, some markets, Nigeria is an example, people have to pay rental 1 year in advance. So you have to pay 12 months rental. So that's unaffordable for so many people. But then you have these fintech products that actually, it's almost like a loan for that 1 year's rental. So the company pays the landlord and then you pay back monthly to to the service provider. So it actually enables you to have a monthly rental. Obviously, there's a fee. And they also have similar things for deposit products. So if you can't afford a deposit, they can actually come in with a level of insurance for the landlord. So with that clever technology, that's quite an overlay of sort of fintech in the property market. But you can actually solve a real problem. So all of a sudden, a whole lot more people are able to access decent rental housing. So that's an example of like really creating, first of all, new products, a new industry almost, but you're solving a real challenge. So I just find it, I just find these markets fascinating. Like I said, it can be extremely challenging to do business, and there's a wide range of cities and markets within Sub-Saharan Africa. South Africa is seen as a more developed country in terms of infrastructure, etc., where there's more development needed and more urban planning, etc., in sort of Nigerian cities. In East Africa, cities are pretty well planned, but there's so much need for growth and housing, etc. So it's funny because all these challenges just create really interesting opportunities, and it's very different. I mean, not to say markets like London, where I lived, aren't exciting, but it's such a different dynamic. And I think it's sometimes, not always, but it's harder to create something new in a very established city. But if you've got this city that's changing and it's dynamic, you could be a developer and create a whole new neighborhood, out of what could be seen as a really rundown industrial space. And then if you bring technology into that, it could be really exciting. So I guess it's still on topic a bit, but just in terms of wider markets and sort of also the opportunity to do social good, because often by solving that problem, you can do financial good, but you can do well financially in a commercial sense, but you can also have a positive social impact. And when talking about ESG, sustainability, so environmental, social governance, a big thing that comes up is in a complex emerging markets, it's almost, while it is the social aspects that become even more important than environmental, because if people don't have access to housing, that's a pressing social sustainability issue. You obviously want to protect the environment, but you need to get people in homes, for the wider social good. So I think just the very nature, and it's something that I've born and bred in Johannesburg in South Africa, and I had the opportunity to live in London, which I did, but it's something that brought me back, and I'm pretty sure I'll be for quite a while, and hopefully I get more opportunity to travel in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is my big passion.
I see. I enjoyed that discussion, especially understanding the flip side of the coin, that challenges can actually become dynamic opportunities when seen in the right angle. And thank you very much, Sean, for joining us today. If our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where should they go?
I think LinkedIn is the best. You can reach out, have a look at my profile, and I'm always happy to connect with new people from different backgrounds, different places, and I'm always happy to help where I can. If it means sharing some information or making an introduction, I'm more than happy to help.
And that is it, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode. See you later. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Wealth Pathways, the Affluence Science Insights Podcast, produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at affluent.lifemanagementsciencelabs.com, where you can join our movement. I'm Marie Stella. Thanks for tuning in.